On August 1, 2025, the world faced a new reality. The date would soon be remembered as a turning point in the history of international trade, as headlines around the globe flashed with urgent updates and uncertainty gripped financial centers from New York to Tokyo. The Trump administration announced sweeping new tariffs on copper and steel imports, sending shockwaves through global markets. Investors and business leaders watched in disbelief as the value of key commodities plummeted and the stock market tumbled in response to the unexpected move. This marked a dramatic shift from decades of relatively stable global trade, where nations had worked together to lower barriers and encourage economic growth. The world had grown accustomed to the free flow of goods and resources, but now, that era seemed to be ending. The tariffs targeted not just traditional rivals, but also some of America's closest allies, directly challenging the principles upheld by the World Trade Organization. The move sent a clear message: old alliances could no longer be taken for granted. Canada, whose economy is deeply intertwined with that of the United States, felt particularly betrayed. Centuries of cooperation and trust were suddenly called into question. The move threatened decades of economic partnership, putting at risk the agreements and understandings that had fostered prosperity on both sides of the border. Global markets reacted with confusion, fear, and anger. Investors scrambled to adjust their portfolios, while businesses braced for higher costs and supply chain disruptions. Leaders around the world warned of a potential global trade war, cautioning that escalating tensions could spiral out of control and damage economies everywhere. All eyes turned to Canada, a nation respected for its diplomacy and measured responses. The world wondered how it would react to this sudden challenge. Would Canada yield to pressure, or would it stand firm against its powerful neighbor? The stakes were high, and the nation's leaders faced difficult choices. The world watched anxiously, waiting for Canada's response. Newsrooms buzzed with speculation, and ordinary people everywhere wondered what the future would hold. The stability of North American trade, once a cornerstone of global commerce, was now shrouded in uncertainty. Shipments stalled, and businesses on both sides of the border faced mounting losses. The announcement was more than just a change in policy, it was a declaration of a new era, one defined by suspicion, competition, and shifting alliances. Allies and adversaries alike scrambled to understand the new rules of engagement. Behind closed doors, urgent meetings and frantic negotiations unfolded as leaders sought to protect their interests. The very foundation of global economic cooperation appeared to be cracking, leaving the world to wonder. Could the damage be repaired, or was this the beginning of a lasting divide? The Trump administration justified the controversial tariffs by invoking Section 232, a rarely used provision that grants the president broad authority to restrict imports for reasons of national security. Section 232 is part of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, a law originally designed to help the U.S. respond to threats that could undermine its economic or military strength. This law allows the president to impose tariffs or other trade barriers if imported goods are deemed to threaten national security, a concept that can be interpreted broadly. The White House argued that a robust domestic steel and copper industry was essential for the nation's defense, claiming that without strong American production, the U.S. could become dangerously dependent on foreign suppliers in times of crisis. However, critics quickly pointed out that these justifications sounded more like economic protectionism than genuine national security concerns, accusing the administration of using security as a cover for shielding U.S. industries from competition. The U.S. Department of Commerce supported the administration's case by reporting a steady decline in domestic metal production, warning that this trend could leave the country vulnerable. The administration insisted that imposing tariffs would revitalize American industry, protect jobs, and ensure the U.S. could meet its own defense needs without relying on potentially unreliable foreign sources. Yet, key U.S. allies like Canada and the European Union were unconvinced, dismissing the idea that their exports posed any real security threat to America. Many international observers saw the national security argument as a thin pretext for advancing economic interests, rather than a legitimate defense measure. Canadian officials strongly rejected the U.S. premise, pointing out that Canadian metals had long been integral to U.S. defense projects and that their countries had a history of close military cooperation. Despite these objections, the U.S. administration remained steadfast, emphasizing the need for self-reliance and the ability to produce essential materials domestically, especially in uncertain times. This fundamental disagreement set the stage for a tense diplomatic standoff, with both sides digging in on their positions. The debate over whether national security concerns were genuine or simply a convenient excuse became a central issue in the broader trade dispute. Many world leaders and analysts warned that using national security as a justification for economic gain could set a dangerous precedent, undermining trust in global trade rules. The tariffs were widely viewed as a challenge to international trade law, raising concerns about the future of the rules-based trading system. Ultimately, the conflict highlighted a deep and fundamental disagreement over the principles that should govern international trade and the limits of national security claims. As tensions rose, the stage was set for a major diplomatic and economic clash, with potential consequences for industries and workers on both sides of the border. Around the world, the Trump administration's rationale for tariffs was met with widespread skepticism, fueling debate about the true motives behind the policy and its impact on the global economy. Before the tariffs, US-Canada trade stood as a shining example of economic integration and cooperation. The border was not just a line on a map, but a vital artery for commerce, with thousands of trucks and shipments moving seamlessly every day. Businesses on both sides relied on this steady, predictable flow, building strong relationships that spanned decades. This partnership was the largest bilateral trade relationship in the world, surpassing all others in both volume and value. Goods, services, and investments moved freely, fueling growth and prosperity for both nations. In 2024, the total trade between the United States and Canada soared past $900 billion, a testament to the deep economic ties and mutual dependence that had developed over generations. Millions of jobs, from factory floors to logistics hubs, depended on this free flow of commerce. Families and communities on both sides of the border built their livelihoods on the certainty that trade would remain open and robust. The United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or USMCA, was designed to make business even smoother, reducing barriers and encouraging innovation and investment across North America. The copper and steel industries were perfect examples of this integration, with raw materials and finished products crossing the border multiple times before reaching consumers. Canadian resources were often processed in American factories, then shipped back for final assembly, creating a tightly woven supply chain that benefited both economies. But the sudden imposition of new tariffs disrupted this carefully balanced order, treating Canadian products as if they were threats rather than trusted imports. A 25% tariff on steel and a 15% tariff on copper effectively blocked the natural flow of goods, making it more expensive and difficult for companies to operate as they had before. Companies that had built their business models on a tariff-free environment suddenly faced a financial crisis, with rising costs and shrinking profit margins threatening their survival. The predictability and stability that once defined US-Canada trade was replaced by uncertainty, sending shockwaves through markets and boardrooms alike. The tariffs quickly created a political rift between two of the world's closest allies, straining relationships that had been built on trust and cooperation. The Canadian government felt blindsided and disrespected by the sudden policy shift, sparking debates and calls for retaliation. The very foundation of North American cooperation began to show troubling cracks, as headlines warned of escalating trade disputes and long-term consequences. Diplomatic channels became strained, and the goodwill that had taken years to build was eroded almost overnight, leaving both nations searching for a path forward. Canada responded firmly to the US tariffs. Ottawa announced reciprocal, proportional countermeasures. The strategy combined retaliatory tariffs with import quotas. Prime Minister Trudeau vowed to defend Canadian interests. The first tier targeted American goods like bourbon and cheese. The goal was to pressure US lawmakers to reverse the policy. The second tier involved tariff rate quotas on steel and copper. This prevented a flood of cheap imports harming Canadian producers. The response was framed as legal under international trade rules. Canada left the door open for de-escalation. The strategy was a calculated move in economic chess. Canada signaled it wouldn't absorb the economic blow without a fight. The countermeasures were temporary, pending US tariff removal. Canada's response was a blend of offense and defense. Canada's countermeasures aimed to protect its industries. The US tariffs threatened Canadian steel and copper sectors. These industries employed tens of thousands in well-paying jobs. The government acted to prevent job losses and plant closures. Market stability was a critical concern. Tariff rate quotas shielded Canada from import diversion. The retaliatory tariffs targeted politically sensitive US regions. Canada hoped to create a domestic lobby against U.S. tariffs. The response asserted Canada's sovereignty and trade principles. Doing nothing would invite further protectionist measures. Canada signaled it wouldn't be a passive victim of trade actions. The response was compliant with WTO and USMCA rights. Canada valued its U.S. relationship but defended its interests. The tariffs had complex consequences in the U.S. Some domestic producers benefited, but many sectors suffered. Manufacturers faced higher input costs, impacting profits. The tariffs threatened jobs in downstream industries. Retaliatory tariffs hit American farmers and iconic goods. The broader effect was increased uncertainty and disruption. Businesses struggled with unpredictable costs and market access. The policy created economic headwinds for U.S. businesses and citizens. In Canada, the U.S. tariffs had immediate effects. Steel and copper producers faced an existential threat. Orders were cancelled and layoffs loomed over industrial towns. Investment plans were put on hold amid uncertainty. Canadian businesses using U.S. components faced higher costs. Retaliatory tariffs had a domestic cost, affecting sectors like food processing. Consumers noticed higher prices for American goods. The increased cost of living was a tangible consequence. The trade dispute shattered assumptions about U.S. reliability. Canadian companies sought new markets to reduce U.S. dependence. This strategic pivot involved short-term costs and challenges. The conflict forced a re-evaluation of Canada's global economic role. The trade war brought the abstract concept into Canadian homes. The psychological impact on the business community was significant. Canada began forging new paths away from U.S. reliance. Experts warned that escalating trade wars rarely produce winners. Protectionist tariffs lead to higher costs and slower growth. History shows trade wars harm industries without achieving goals. The WTO was sidelined, risking a chaotic global economy. Tariffs act as a tax on imports, raising consumer prices. Experts argued for better solutions like education and innovation. U.S. tariff policy shifted North American alliances. Canada strengthened ties with Mexico, sharing a free trade interest. The Canada-Mexico partnership was a response to U.S. protectionism. They coordinated responses and challenged U.S. tariffs in forums. This realignment changed North American dynamics. Canada accelerated trade diversification beyond North America. The government expanded agreements with the EU and Pacific Rim. The U.S. market was no longer a safe bet for Canadian businesses. This strategic pivot could reshape Canada's economic identity. The conflict revealed Canada's critical vulnerability. The global trading system was at a crossroads. The actions illuminated the fragility of economic partnerships. Nations reconsidered alliances and trade policies. The events forced a re-evaluation of global cooperation. The future of global trade remains uncertain.